Okay, guys, we will go ahead and get started with today's session. Today, we're going to be kind of expanding on what Karen introduced to us on early visual development, which really focused on visual fixation and visual attention. And we're going to start to shift into visual motor development and some more of that middle phase of visual development and how we use our vision to do something. So today's objectives is that as participants, we will be able to identify signs of impaired visual motor development consistent with CVI, and then being able to describe those functional implications. And then we'll start to discuss some different strategies or approaches to support these kids as we're working to help them learn new skills. And I think full description of visual motor development is likely not fully needed within this group of people, just with everybody working within the therapy field. But visual motor development is really just using visual information to inform how we're using our body to do some kind of gross motor or fine motor coordination task. So we're using our vision to inform us how to do something. So for example, this little kid here, if he were to go stack a block, he needs to look at where he's placing that block and move his hand in response to that movement plan. If he were to get up and try to walk away, he's going to have to look at his environment to tell his body how to move to hopefully avoid stepping on all those Legos, because that would not be comfortable at all. And piggybacking off of what Karen talked to us last week is the goal for visual motor development in CVI is that we want to first work on turning on that visual system. And then once the visual system is working and we have visual focus, visual fixation, that's where we want to then help the child use their body to increase their interaction with their environment and daily materials while using the vision that they have available. And really, the more that they can visually engage while moving their body, the more that they can interact with those materials, the toys, and their world around them. And throughout today's presentation, I'm going to pull back this tree of vision through CVI Scotland and Dutton and colleagues that helps us kind of look at what different areas of the brain help control or support different actions. So we see the dorsal stream on the right, which is more of that search and attention and can help us with more of those movement pieces of how are we going to move our body and focus on things visually. Whereas the ventral stream is where we're kind of putting more conscious recognition and kind of naming and identification of different things in our environment as well. So to start, we have that dorsal stream, which is our search, attention, and guidance of movement system, where it will help us to know how we're going to use our visual information to move our hands, our arms, our legs, our body when doing different tasks. But it's also going to look at how we can find and locate an object of visual interest. So these two pieces together will help us find and locate something and then use our movement from our body to get access to it with visual guidance. And then in comparison, there's also this middle area of the tree where we're using both our ventral and our dorsal systems at the same time. So what we're doing is we're building on conscious recognition of our surroundings, that visual attention and visual search to help us with navigation, specifically the idea of finding routes and exploring our environments. So we're going to work on mapping out our environment and be able to navigate around whether it's familiar or unfamiliar environments, crowded or busy environments. We may see varied performance in individuals with CVI, but we're using both of these streams of visual processing to help us navigate our surroundings. So I think it's helpful to go through kind of what things may be reported by parents as challenges, just to know that these are things that are maybe kind of red flags for CVI concerns. And then it's also just helpful so then you guys know kind of questions you can ask related to visual processing on when a child may be having those types of functional concerns day to day. So a child with CVI, the caregiver may explain related to navigation that their child has more hesitancy when navigating unfamiliar environments, just because they're less visually aware and they've taken in less of that visual information. They haven't learned it quite yet. So then using their body to move around that environment when they're not as familiar may be more challenging for them. Parents may report that in a familiar environment, such as home, they may not run into furniture or be as clumsy, but in places like stores or parks, they may seem unaware of things in their way, and they may just be more clumsy when interacting with their environment because they haven't quite found out that way to really map out their space and they haven't fully figured it out visually. We may also hear that in busy places that a child may need to hold on to the arm of an adult, or they may cling or stay really close to adults because they're uncertain of where they're moving. We know with that visual complexity that taking in all that visual information was something new and unfamiliar, but then also when there's a lot of pieces of information to take in could be challenging for kids with CBI. So busy places could be challenging to then want to navigate through. And overall with navigation, we may also hear that their skills with how they walk about a space, how clumsier, how nimble they are going about environments may vary. And that may be linked to the familiarity of it. It may be linked to, are they more tired or fatigued? If they're tired or fatigued, the ability to pull out and use their visual processing skills may be lower, which then could impact their mobility skills. And for parents, when they report on how they interact with the world using their body and their vision together, we may sometimes hear that a parent sees that their child uses their sense of touch more than their sense of sight to interact with toys in their environment. They may say that their child will look at a toy and then look away from it and then reach for it. It's often that we see that a child being tasked to use their vision and use their body and move their muscles in a way to reach and access a toy can be challenging to do it at the same time because maybe the motor demands are high, but also the visual attention and looking demands are high. So they may look to find it, then look away, and then reach to where they think the toy was based off their looking. But sometimes pairing that together can be challenging. Additionally, a child may be reported as having a hard time playing with toys that have a lot of pieces to look at. So again, this pulls in that complexity piece. If there's more visual information to take in, then keeping focus on that and then using our hands and eyes together cooperatively to play and interact with those toys in what would be perceived traditionally a functional way may be more challenging for these children. And then parents may report in terms of overall motor skills that they may just see that their child has that poor hand-eye coordination. Again, if we're challenging a child with a motor skill that's hard, if the visual demand is also challenging and also high on the kid, it may be hard to pair those two pieces together and be successful with the task. That's where we may have to lower the visual demand or lower the motor demand to see more of that coordination. Parents may report that their child is clumsy and they don't know how to move their body to avoid obstacles, or they may just not even be aware of obstacles in their environment. They may report that their child doesn't look down when they're moving their body for navigation. And sometimes we even hear that children are not looking down at the tabletop surface or things in their lower visual field. They're just not aware of something if it's not as close up to their face or at eye level. So that may impact how they complete motor tasks as well. And then lastly, we may hear from caregivers that children with CVI or visual processing concerns have challenges learning to crawl, roll, or walk due to decreased visual motivation to move to a new spot in their environment. They may just have overall decreased exploration of their environment. So when we're thinking about how we can kind of take in this information of things are challenging for a child, what we want to do to try to approach supporting building of skills is looking at balancing the task demands with the task at hand. So the goal of improving visual engagement to guide action and movement, what we may want to do is look at how can we adapt the environment and how can we adapt objects and toys in our environment as well. and see if that will help provide more success with day-to-day tasks. And one way that we like to visualize this sometimes is just thinking about this different spectrum for activities. So first we can think about the task. Is it easy or hard for the child? Is the environment a low-level distraction or a high-level distraction? Are the objects simple or complex? When completing a task that is hard for the child, we may want to go towards the low-level distraction in the environment and a more simple object of toys to kind of balance that task and environment demand. Whereas if something is easy for the child to do, it's a play task that they've done for a long time, they really have this down, that's where in the environment we can start to add some distraction in the background, whether it's more clutter or maybe some noise in the background or more visual distractions, or we can pull in some toys or objects that are more complex. So we really want to think about this balance as we're kind of treatment planning or approaching intervention for kids with CVI. And next, we're just going to go through some different areas of ways we can pull in kind of visual preferences or think through these different task or environmental adaptations. And the first one here is light. And these are some things that Karen introduced last week of how we can bring in light to improve our visual attention. But the next thing is we're going to keep on working on using light to increase visual attention in children where that is a visual motivator for them. But then we're also going to work to seeing how can we then pair in a motor demand for a task. So for example, in the upper left, we have that shiny bucket where we have a toy that's lit up in the inside, and seeing if we can either remove a toy from the inside or maybe work on reaching towards that container with a toy in our hand and releasing and letting go. Or we've talked about using light boards where we can work on sustaining visual engagement and focus while placing puzzle pieces. Often what we can see is, so for a puzzle, we may see more of that look away, and then try to use our hands to place the pieces. But if a kid's visual engagement is decreased during these types of tasks, they may have a hard time adjusting the position of the puzzle piece or placing things more accurately. So that's where pulling in the light in the background could help improve that hand-eye coordination, and they would still have that ability to use their vision to inform and guide their movements of how they place those puzzle pieces. And then another thing that we sometimes will do is use those light up wristbands. I think Karen mentioned that, but we can use light up wristbands to see if that can help a kid sustain more visually guided reach or looking at what their hands are doing during a task. Like I said, when we task a child with CVI to do a new motor skill, having our vision not be supported by something more stimulating could lead to them looking away while they're using their hands. And it's really beneficial for hand-eye coordination tasks that we can watch what our hands are doing so we can learn how to adjust our performance so we can work to being successful with how we're interacting with a toy or a material. Another way of adapting toys that's quite simple is using reflective tape to add like a shiny element to them that it's going to be more visually stimulating versus just a solid color. So we see that here on this slide with highlighting the different slots or the openings of toys for kids to look at that and then work to reach and put their toy towards the shiny outline of either the shape sorter, the piggy bank coin slot, or even the fish bowl. And the nice thing about reflective tape is when light hits it, it becomes even more stimulating and has almost a movement quality to it. So we can even do that for toys such as blocks. We can cover those with those types of materials so they're not so they are more visually stimulating, so we can make the visual engagement easier. So then the child can put more work and effort towards the motor component of stacking the blocks. Similarly, we can do the pegboard up there. I think the nice thing about something like the pegboard is it also provides some contrast of color of where we're going to be working towards and reaching towards in some circumstances. And also sometimes we'll use this colored tape to do some mass repetitive practice at different tests, like we're going to grab our pants and we're going to pull them up from right here. We're going to give them a really strong visual cue of where we're going to do that. We can put reflective tape tags onto zippers. So it's more of an easy thing to focus on and look at either on a backpack or a coat, but using this to pull in our visual focus so then we can use our hands and eyes a little bit more effectively together. Another common thing that we may talk about is reducing our visual clutter. So it's always a good method of practice of just kind of starting with less, and then as a child is more successful and they show that they can handle and interact with a certain number of toys or number of pieces in front of them, then you can kind of increase how many things are shown to them, make it more complex over time. If you offer an activity to a child and they really don't visually engage or they have a really hard time with it, it's always good just to kind of scale it back and see at what point can they be successful to where they're able to search and find for something and then appropriately use that activity or that toy. One thing I had mentioned is sometimes with kids with CVI, we see that that lower visual field, we may have decreased awareness, and that can impact mobility and navigation. But we also see often that it can impact how a child is interacting with materials, either on a floor surface while they're on their belly, like a baby in tummy time, or while they're at a tabletop completing tasks like looking at books or pictures or technology like an iPad. So often we can talk about presenting items upright so they're at eye level and they're out of that lower visual field that may be a little bit more tricky. Doing this with different stands, book stands, an iPad stand, or even having things presented vertically on a wall. That way we're bringing something out of that visual field that's a little bit more challenging to focus on, so then their brain can really work on the cognitive demand, or maybe they're working on the speech type activity. Let's not challenge their motor skill, their visual skills as well. Let's make it a little bit simpler and more accessible for them. And the next few things I'm going to talk about are more on the navigation side. So again, that lower visual field, we may see that there's decreased attention to that area, whether it's we don't really look down, we're always looking forward when we're doing navigation tasks, or we have a hard time mapping out our environment. And when we're talking about navigation, we often will talk about things we can do that are adaptations. And that is specifically changing the environment to encourage attention to the lower visual field. And then we can also talk about remediation. And these are activities to help the child learn to look into those challenging visual fields. So when we think of adaptations, one of the main things that we can do is try to bring visual attention to that lower visual field with something that is visually stimulating or noticeable for the child. So often we can do some brightly colored, high contrasting colored tape or materials on the ground to bring attention to either steps or changes in floor threshold or floor surface. On top of this, we could always do some prompting, but that is more of a remediation approach. Or then say at school, we want a child to really be able to map out where their classroom is or where these specific places that they're going to be entering doors. We can try to highlight an area in their environment with that visually stimulating material to help that be a little bit of an easier task. Another adaptation that I've had some families say has been successful for their child is bringing attention to their lower visual field with shoes that are actually visually stimulating with a preferred color or a more bold, brightly colored shoe that will contrast with the floor better. So whether it's kind of brightly colored red shoes that are a little bit more neon like the ones at the bottom, or even some families have done light up shoes. I've also had some families had some success with these are like the Ikiki, I think is what it's called, the shoes that have the on-off squeakers, where families would put those on during steps and it would help their child look down at the steps a little bit better. Obviously, that is using the hearing versus vision to really fully direct that attention, but sometimes that multi-sensory option of bringing in some noise to encourage their child to look down at the ground could be helpful. And then on the remediation side, one thing we can do is work with a child to participate in things like obstacle courses or playground play. to encourage looking at their surroundings. And of course, doing this at the child's comfort level and being there to support them in areas where they're more hesitant or unsure, and really kind of coaching them through of let's look here, let's look down. You can tap the ground to try to direct their vision towards an obstacle, and helping them navigate these areas with support and building their comfort with bringing their eyes down, looking around their environment, and really trying to take in this information to inform how they're going to move their body. Additionally, giving some verbal prompting to guide their movement and give them cues to kind of prepare for changes in their environment. So we can sometimes work on alerting the child when there are going to be changes like curbs, or the sidewalk turns into a different type of asphalt, or it's going to change to grass, giving those prompts so they can focus to look down and bring their awareness down there, because they may not naturally shift their attention down to that lower visual field. And just giving them a heads up if there's going to be any kind of navigation or mobility obstacles coming their way. And then practice walking through new spaces, especially if we have the opportunity to do this when the spaces are a little less busy, whether that's grocery stores or even a child's classroom. We want to help the child learn the space. So sometimes before a school year starts, it could be good for a child to go into their new classroom and map out, here's the door where I go into, where's my cubby, here is my desk, this is the teacher's desk. And doing that before, say like the open house where there's going to be a lot of other kids and it's going to be really busy and loud. Sometimes taking kids through these spaces independently or solo with just them and an adult to talk through can help them learn those spaces better when they're less busy and complex. And of course, if a child is school age or even an early intervention and getting vision services, I would always recommend asking the school orientation and mobility specialist or TVI if they had any specific recommendations related to the child's navigation needs. So what we'll do is we're going to go through 2 scenarios real quick of different visual motor tasks that we could work on. And so this specific child, their goal is completing a puzzle. They have gotten better with accurately placing toys during fine motor play. They're putting the shapes into a shape sorter. They're able to do the piggy bank coin into the slot. But what they're seeing is, as they're starting to do more puzzles like this, is that they're frequently looking away while trying the task and trying to place it into a spot and having less accuracy with placing the piece. And they don't seem to efficiently scan the puzzle to find the place to put the specific pieces. So if we go back to this little diagram here, this task for the child is hard. So most likely we don't want to have high level distraction, and ideally a more complex object or toy may impede their participation. And that's maybe what we're seeing right now. So ideally, we want to find a low-level distraction environment for us to be working on this new challenging task. And then we want to try to find a way to adapt or simplify the toy. So I thought we could maybe have people put in the chat ideas that they have of that we can adapt this specific puzzle or simplify what we're showing the child to support their participation. So if anyone wants to put anything in the chat or unmute and speak out your ideas. There's no right or wrong answer. Kirsten says cover up parts of the puzzle, cover up half the puzzles. Ashley. Diane said make the background black. Perfect. Vicki said take black paper and only show one of the holes. Yeah. Put it up vertical instead of horizontal. That's a great idea. So I think a lot of these ideas are awesome. Leslie said reflective tape. Good job, guys. So here's 2 options. You know, these aren't the right or wrong options, but there's some of the things that you guys have mentioned. So making a black background so we can really isolate the pieces itself and get rid of that extra picture that was in the background, which could be visually distracting. So having that darked out by like tape, or even on smaller puzzles, we've used Sharpies. But in this case, you can use contact paper and put it right over the top of the puzzle and get something like an X-Acto knife and actually just cut out to where you only see the shapes, which I think is really nice. Like other people said, you can cover up parts of the puzzle to show fewer spots at a time, and you can really notice, how many things do we have to cover up while we're doing this, and you can kind of slowly show more or show less based off the child's response. So that was a great job, guys. The next scenario that we'll go over is a little bit more like a gross motor navigation type goal. So this child, they're tall enough to step over the lip of the tub, and they have the gross motor skills where they think they should be able to. But this child is having a lot of hesitancy stepping into the bathtub, despite doing similar motions appropriately when playing on more colorful playground equipment. They can lift up their leg just right, but when they do it, they're dragging their foot along the surface of the tub, and it looks like they're doing that to just be aware of where the drop off or the side of the tub is, and then when he would get to the bottom of the tub. So they seem just kind of unaware of where things are when stepping over this tub. So again, this task is hard. There's pretty low level distraction. There's not other things in the tub. And then it's a pretty simple environment already. But I think one piece that's kind of tricky about it is it's all the same color. So the caregiver reports that getting out of the tub is fine because they have a different color tile compared to the tub color, which is all white. Is there any ideas of how we can adapt the situation to help them better see or perceive kind of stepping in and out of the tub? Stephanie says some reflective or black tape at the ledge of the tub. Leslie says brightly colored tape on the tubs. Yeah, that's all good ideas. So I think that low level of contrast that this task provides the child makes it hard for them to confidently do this task. So putting some kind of high contrast colored tape or strip on the bathtub ledge would be a good idea to provide more of a visual. And in this case, and with other cases of kids having difficulties going in and out of the tub, something like a colored bath mat to increase the contrast of where they're reaching their foot to could also be helpful. Yep, high contrast mats. Good job, guys. And then one last piece of information I wanted to kind of touch on that isn't strictly visual development, but it's a part of this area of what we would consider middle visual development is interaction with 2D materials. What we see with kids that are kind of in this area of middle visual development is that we're starting to increase our visual engagement with things that are not needing to be tangible 3D items, but we may need to still have supports to show more focus or interest and attention towards things that are more picture-based. And what we may see in this range of skills is that there may need to be some decreased visual clutter. Sometimes we see that we need to prioritize having real life images versus cartoon depictions of images, because there's more processing that goes on to need to understand that a cartoon representation of something is the same as a real life image. And backlighting is still pretty helpful for these kids to increase their visual attention and interest for sustained periods of time. So 2D material interactions, we're going to start with just building that looking and that focus. And then we're going to progress those skills to be actually using some more of those visual motor skills. So we're going to be looking so we can draw pictures, we can write letters, we can complete worksheets and read, or even look at books and point out pictures in a book and things like that. So we really want to support making the looking aspect of it being easier. And these are just some quick considerations that we'll go through. So again, we have our tree of vision. And on the right with the dorsal stream, we have our ability to find and have visual attention and search for things. And that comes into play with 2D materials because we have to be able to first attend to an object. But then with the ventral stream, that's where we're going to start assigning meaning or recognition to what these things are, whether it's letters, numbers, colors, our animals on our toys, things like that. So both of these areas of our visual streams are going to come into play for 2D materials. And so again, we want to think about this array of complexity when it comes to 2D images, where something on an iPad that has movement and high contrasting colors is going to be less difficult to look at, more visually stimulating compared to a book that has multiple pictures and multiple components, such as the ones on the right, which will be more challenging to look at. The books on the left, the one with Elmo, if we were working with a child to just reach and touch a picture on a page and say something like, "Where's Elmo?" and see if the child can touch the picture on the page accurately. It'd be much easier with the one on the left versus the one on the right, where there's multiple pictures and scenes in that Elmo book. Being able to accurately identify with our vision and then do a reach paired with that search and find request would be much more challenging. So sometimes starting with simple and then grading up and making more challenging as we're trying to figure out what a child can best interact with could be our best approach. And again, here's just an example of image recognition. Those real life pictures may be easier to understand what they are versus more cartoon or abstract representations. If we remove the color from the objects, that may make it more challenging as well, because we are truly just having to interpret what those lines mean as they come together, and are they the same thing as the thing that we would see in real life. So this is important to consider when we're thinking about using pictures for making choices or communication. Sometimes kids with CVI, they'll have an easier job looking at pictures and understanding what they mean and truly recognizing it if it's a direct image of, say, their preferred snack or their preferred toy versus a more abstract choice. And then multisensory learning in this phase is also really important. So being able to pull in as many senses as possible to help them utilize their sense of touch, their hearing, alongside their vision to learn new concepts. And these are just some examples, some different ways that we can really pull in different senses to kind of hone in on new skills and not solely relying on our vision, but pulling in other aspects of play and learning to build new skills. And then lastly, for handwriting, that can be something that can be really tricky for kids with CVI, because again, they're going to have to look, sustain looking, and they're going to have to watch what they're doing to inform how they would either, say, trace a letter or copy a letter. So it is getting kind of complex using their visual and their motor systems together. With kids who are in this middle phase, I think there's always a time and place for use of technology. And of course, we want to use it appropriately and use it not too much or not too little. But what I've seen is that kids with CVI, tech-based opportunities to practice tracing and learning letters can be really helpful. And we can even do these with a stylus. So it's almost like they are still using pencil and paper. It's just more tech-based. They still get practice holding their pencil and learning grasp skills and those visual motor integration pieces. But apps like I Write Words or Writing Wizard can be really helpful to give them something that's a little bit bigger to copy or trace, and then also give them something that has high contrast materials that they can use to learn how to write these letters with backlighting, which I think sometimes it's that lighted component can be really good. And then also kids are often motivated by using technology such as an iPad. And then if we're doing something like pencil and paper, I think just giving those visual cues of we're starting at red, we're going to go down to green, and then we're going to make a bump going to blue and wrap around. So being able to have those visual cues and we can give those verbal prompts alongside it could also be helpful for letter formation. So that is all of my talking for this didactic. Does anybody have any questions on any of that content? You can put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute, I